We are here as men of peace, but we are here also to declare our full and forthright support of what is in great measure a military alliance.
But in the background is a much wider and more suggestive question connected with the fact that Canada seems to have moved from a pre-national to a post-national phase of existence without ever having been a nation.
That bigness and complexity are functions not so much of numbers as of ideas.
We built a country, east and west and north. We built it on an infrastructure that deliberately resisted the continental pressure of the United States. For 120 years we've done it with one signature of a pen. You've reversed that, thrown us into the north-south influence of the United States.
Hello and welcome to the podcast of the Red Ensign. This is the 8th episode of the Red Ensign Live. On the Red Ensign Live, we have a lecture, discussion of some prepared events, some prepared discussion of current events, and then there's a Q&A section that I've been collecting questions for. Some of the questions will be a little bit of a repeat from the Twitter space that I did on Friday night, but I didn't record that, and I had a lot of complaints that I didn't record it. I didn't record it because I want the Twitter spaces that are done occasionally to be an opportunity for people I don't know to come and interact with the content. I said this to some people I know. At present, the intellectual dissident sphere in Canadian politics is far too small to have any real political impact. And so I'm working very hard to try to reach out to other people. Part of that means inviting people to speak who I don't know and whose positions I don't really want to be associated with in a persistent way. So having unrecorded spaces is a way to kind of have that dialogue without anyone, without having to have a durable artifact linking the Red Ensign to whatever or the random people on Twitter who I invite to speak in my space might have to say. This is a podcast a podcast topic I've wanted to address for a while, and it just so happened that the last 2 weeks provided the perfect vehicle to have this discussion. As some of you will know, over the last 2 weeks, Mark Carney introduced his new budget to Parliament. The budget, which he has been calling for months now, a generational investment in Canada, took the historically unprecedented step of separating government spending into capital expenditures and operating expenditures, with the promise of balancing the operating budget, but making very large investments via the capital budget. Right. This is a classic piece of business accounting, and I'm actually in a neutral sense, I would be glad to see this come to Canadian federal and both federal, provincial, and municipal budgeting. However, the Canadian budget in this regard, let's say, fell short. So it is true that Carney made some kind of modest operational cuts. He's promising to eliminate 16,000 positions in the federal bureaucracy and have like $12 billion a year in cost savings over the next several years. Whether any of that will actually materialize or not, we'll see. But I think it is clear that there's an intent to reel in some of the indulgent spending that went on in the federal bureaucracy over the last several years. But what was deeply underwhelming in the budget is the capital expenditure side. So Carney announced in tranches his big capital programs for projects. But before he even did that, it's worth noting that huge parts of the existing federal budget were recategorized as capital expenditures in order to make the numbers work, which is how you get to an $80 billion a year budget with only fairly small actual capital expenditures in projects. You simply recategorize entitlement spending as capital expenditures. Kind of a nifty little accounting trick, but it doesn't change the underlying reality. And when we look at the list of capital projects that Carney identifies, it's got 3 projects that together would bring liquefied natural gas to the west coast, the north coast of BC, an area, it should be noted, where it is presently illegal to board LNG onto ships and sail it to the open ocean in any potential port. So I'm not sure what you're going to do with a liquefied natural gas plant and pipelines going to the north coast of BC if it's illegal to ship, and if these projects are facing significant environmental hurdles. So it's very possible that these 3 Keystone projects don't actually get done. But more than that, even if they got done, in the Pacific, there is enormous competition in the liquefied natural gas market, right? If your chief clients are China or Japan, the key North Pacific nations, you have direct competition from pipelines with Russia for natural gas. You're never going to be able to cost competitively. You're never going to be able to win the cost competition there. Equally, so your actual target is all these island Pacific nations or island Pacific jurisdictions. Many of them are part of larger nations that have land pipelines. But you're in all those instances, you're competing with Australia and various other jurisdictions that all have access to the same fundamental body of water. And there's significant exposed capacity in the region. Whereas if you built the pipeline facing east or even to Hudson's Bay, you would have the opportunity to attack the enormously underserved market of Europe and compete directly with the Americans. This is whatever you might call a generational investment in Canada. This is the opposite, right? So a generational investment in Canada would be an attempt to fundamentally reorient the economy of the country and break the dependence on the United States in order to create negotiating leverage in that relationship. This is not that. This is classic public work spending in order to subsidize certain interests in certain resource interests in the country, and to try to placate the unquiet members of the Alberta elite. This is not an attempt to restructure Canada's economy. And the same is true of the various other small projects here. We've got a series of mines through the Shield country, and I guess there's one down in New Brunswick that they want to make a public investment in. And there's a far north hydroelectric project. None of these projects are large in the scale of Canadian resource spending. They might individually be large, but you could spend 10 or 100 times this money developing the Canadian North and not exhaust the economically viable opportunities. So we're really not talking about what we're talking about is something Canadian governments have done repeatedly for the last 100 years. We're not talking about a fundamental change in direction. So that's the Canadian budget. It is packaged as a fundamental change in direction, but what it really is, like the pivot on immigration, is an attempt to shore up the existing power structure on existing lines to avoid discontent breaking the system. It is not a fundamental change, and it continues through the $80 billion deficit on its collision course with the hard realities of exhausting the productive base of the country. The second event that occurred this week that I wanted to talk about is an online right event. The philosopher associated with neo-reactionary thinking, Nick Land, did a 2.5-hour interview with Benjamin Boyce, who has interviewed me. I think he's a really excellent interviewer. And he spent most of the interview discussing a concept that actually comes from the blogger Spandrel, the neo-reactionary trichotomy. And the neo-reactionary trichotomy argues that there are sort of three groups, clusters of thought that drive people, or drove people in the 2010s, toward neo-reactionary dark enlightenment thinking. Those three pathways are a kind of money and markets pathway, where you see people often from the libertarian tradition, often very interested in technology and capital, often computer programmers, those kinds of people, looking at the problem of modernity from that point of view. You have the ethno-nationalist group, who are looking at modernity as a process of liquidating ethnic groups and the traditions associated with them. And you have the theonomists, people who look at modernity and compare it to the standard of biblical morality and render their critique from there. Right? These are the people who are very interested in, and all three of these have an overlapping set of issues that they are looking at: natural hierarchy, heritage, gender roles, the relationship between race and the nation, the idea of subsidiary power, and this desperate desire for freedom or exit from the neoliberal system, the neoliberal, neoconservative kind of duopoly on power in the West. And so I thought it would be fascinating to see what Nick Land has to say. Unfortunately, I have to say the interview is conducted brilliantly. Nick Land continues to be much, much smarter than I will ever hope to be. The analysis is brilliant, but it boils down to 2.5 hours of 150 IQ Anglo cope. And I say that because Nick Land takes this idea of the neo-reactionary trichotomy, and he makes the argument that these three forces sit as a political coalition behind MAGA and behind the incoming reform movement in the UK, and that the essential binding agent between them has to be their common enemy in the left and its attempt to liquidate them, and that the one indispensable requirement that you should look at for participants in this coalition is that they not take actions that break the coalition, right? And so you can, oscillate to one axis or another within that trichotomy, but as long as you're not threatening the coalition, you're fine. And that together, these forces of the neo-reactionary trichotomy are going to make a go at fixing the crisis of modernity and getting the Anglo-Protestant Whig tradition, as he would term it, or as I would term it, the mercantile empire that is now ruled from Washington through the Gay, back on track. Unfortunately, I understand why you would want this to be true, but the American empire isn't failing the American empire is failing for the reason all empires fail, and it's failing inexorably due to these perhaps irreversible, but certainly nearly irreversible historical forces. Those forces are mass migration, elite degeneration, and the debasing of the currency, coupled with the political impossibility of reforming the entitlement system. So you saw this in Rome with the bread dole that just got bigger and bigger and bigger, but you was impossible to reform. You see it today with the fact that entitlement reform is untouchable for any person in politics. And then the last reason is the collapse in belief of the religious meta-narrative. For Rome, it was the pagan cults, and then most importantly, the cult of the emperor that underlay the political system and justified Roman rule. And today, it is the collapse of the belief in liberal progressivism, right? If you compare the way people believe in liberal scientific progress today versus the way they believed in liberal scientific progress in 1970 versus the way they believed in it in 1910, you will see the horizon of their thinking getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And really the last cope they have left is AI. And AI is a fascinating piece of technology. I've worked with it a little bit in the real world. It has tremendous applications, particularly in defense and in surveillance. But fundamentally, AI doesn't solve core problem, the core patronage problem or the core wealth generation problem in the American empire. Problems which get worse every year because of elite degeneration, because of the growth of the grain dole, right? And problems which are accelerating because every group of people within, well, now even in the imperial core, have decided that their sectional interests are more important than the integrity of the whole. And so you see the last group who was not in on the act of looting the empire, white American conservatives, are now in on the act of trying to leverage their sectional interest to maximize their economic gain out of the system, right? It's just looting at this point. Nobody believes in the project, or at least very, very, very few people believe in it. And so, while it's true that you have this coalition of forces trying to kind of revivify the empire, it's a pretty feeble attempt. Their hearts aren't in it. And there's another really, really important problem. And that is the people who are in charge of the mega coalition are not the neo-reactionary trichotomy. There are people like Susie Wiles, the chief of staff down at the White House, who is a Reagan-era conservative, who is, I mean, let's face it, she's a boomer woman, right? And she has all of the prejudices that go with that position. And she is the iron fist who controls information within the White House. And and so she is element A on which the administration stands. And element B is another coalition which does not have the long-term interests of the empire at heart. Here you have Mr. Netanyahu celebrating that he got Twitter X to disable the translate from Hebrew feature in order to reduce anti-Semitism. You can infer from that whatever you would like, but it's not techno-capital, it's not theonomy, and it's not ethnats who have control of the actual levers of power inside the Trump administration. They might form important parts of the political coalition that brought the Trump administration to power, but all the doors and all the keys are held by these people. Okay, they're not held by the Nick Lands of the world. They're not held by the Aaron McIntyres of the world. They're not held by people like me, people like you. They're held by these people. And these people are not engaged in a credible project to reform the empire. They're engaged in the same project that the American elite have been engaged in for quite a long time, really since they were set on this course by Bush 1 when he laid it out in his New World Order speech. And they have not adjusted their thinking really very far at all, except that they know they now need more revenue, and so they're trying to extract more and more from the periphery of the American empire via tariffs and via mandatory NATO spending with American contractors. It's not working. The deficit is getting larger and larger. Trump's strategy to justify the tariffs to his commercial oligarchy is that he's going to write checks to Americans with tariff revenue. This is not going well. This is not an effective attempt to reform the empire and get it onto a sound footing. There's no retreat from the overextensions of the empire. There's no winding down of the war in Ukraine. There's no reduction in the number of military bases. There's no effective negotiation over spheres of influence with China or Russia or Iran. None of that is going. There's no retrenchment. This is not Hadrian reducing the commitments of the empire and fortifying in. This is these are people who have not updated their thinking to reflect current circumstances. All right. This is my friend, the Canadian boomer, holding up his middle fingers and saying, we hold all the doors, we hold all the keys. I know you're frustrated. I know your frustrations are legitimate, but you can't do a damn thing about it, and I'm going to get my pension. All right. That's what you're looking at going on right now. And efforts to say otherwise, efforts to say that the trajectory of politics has been fundamentally changed by this nominal tilt to the right, are just basically misled. They're looking at fairly superficial rhetoric, and they're expressing what I think is quite legitimate gratitude to Trump for closing the border to illegal immigration, which I'm sure makes your life quite a bit better if you're an American, especially living in border states. But the trajectory on which the thing is moving has not been changed. And we are all on course for the end of this merchant republic, the end of this global hegemonic unit, right? That's where we're headed. And we need to all get ourselves prepared for the world that is going to be, rather than continuing to be focused on the world that is dying under our feet. Which brings me to my interaction with somebody whose name I had not heard since childhood, Dean Blundell, who is like a Canadian lib radio host from, I don't even know when he last had an actual job, but he went on Twitter this week to go after the conservative, I think it's the shadow finance minister, somebody like that, and talk about how he's, disgusting because he's an evangelical and has 5 kids. Now, it turns out that he actually is a Catholic, not an evangelical. He actually has 6 kids, not 5. And his wife is not living at home in, cult slavery, as Blundell describes it. She's a working doctor. Why do I mention this? Because Blundell's, but the Garnet, hang on, Garnet Janus is one of his compatriots down at the CPC, went on Twitter to defend him, pointed out, they're a lovely Catholic family with 6 kids and she's working as a doctor, and isn't it all great? The problem that she's got is she's gone and defended Garnett's family through the lens of the values of liberal progressivism. They're great people because she's a doctor. That means she's well educated and working outside the home, and the opposite of this kind of anti-feminist caricature which has been drawn from by Blundell. Why do I raise this at the end of the lecture of about the fall of the American empire and the chaos into which we're about to descend? Because it's an opportunity to realize the requirement to evaluate our circumstances not based on the values of our dying enemies, but based on our own values. All right. Not unlike Mr. Garnett, I have a wife and 4 children. My wife is now a homeschool mom, but she has an engineering degree from one of the best engineering schools in the country. And when I evaluate her, I don't do so on the basis of her success according to liberal feminist priors about what a woman can or should be. Instead, I evaluate her life, our life, based on an absolute commitment to the values that I hold, as expressed partly in this podcast, partly elsewhere. But one of the requirements to living through this period is the ability to not hold up the perspective of the dying order as the measuring stick for the value of the things that you do, whether that's your economic success within that system, whether that's your social success according to its standards of behavior, whether that's your academic success based on the number of academic papers that you get published, or whether your books are read at universities, but rather to have standards for the success in those areas that are based on absolute principles to which you're prepared to have you're prepared to have loyalty regardless of what other people think of them, right? And so in this moment, as so many things fall away, it is absolutely critical that we hold up measuring sticks based on these absolute principles. I laid this out not especially competently in the article I wrote on Substack called "The Politics of Absolutism," trying to argue that the position of this publication, the position that we ought to hold to, is this set of absolute standards of real truth. Things that we would believe today, things that we would believe if you dropped us down in the late Roman Republic, things that we would believe if you dropped us down 1,000 years in the future, about what a man should be, about what a woman should be, about how to lead a people, about the responsibility that you bear to your people, to your family, and to yourself, and to history and posterity. And so as we go forward in this treacherous time, I would highly encourage everyone to periodically take a step back from the discourse, take a step back from either what people on the online right are saying or what people in the mainstream culture are saying, and take a moment to compare yourself, your life, and your achievements to these absolute standards. What would my great-grandfather think of me? What will my great-grandchild think of me? And hold that up as your guiding principle in your life. All right, so that's what I wanted to get through for the lecture portion of this podcast. I want to go from here to go through some viewer questions. So just hold on a second while I get my list of questions up. Hang on. Okay, so First question here is about the Dominion Society and their recent public demonstrations. So the question here is, the Dominion Society, I interviewed its president. I think that's his title, Daniel Tyree. It is an organization dedicated to advocating for remigration and all of the kind of escalatory steps that might lead to remigration, things like restricting migration, all of that kind of stuff. And they have recently been performing. I think performing is the right word. They've recently been doing some live stunts designed to get attention for their organization and to drive discussion on the topic of remigration. I think it's important to understand that this is not quite the same thing that is typically meant by protest. They're not petitioning the government in the classical sense, certainly at this stage. These are like postering campaigns. These are highway overpass signs, all that kind of stuff. It's an attempt to get people's attention on the issue, right? And to raise awareness that there are organized people attempting to do something about these problems. I think there's some merit in this approach. We'll have to see how the strategy comes out, but I don't think it's a terrible idea to use non-online media channels to try to route around the efforts that may well be made here over time to shut that conversation down. So I'm not broadly against the strategy the way I would be if they were going to the Parliament buildings and getting 20,000 people to stand outside it for some reason. These are kind of small targeted events that range from like postering and leaflet campaigns to putting up big signs. I don't mind that approach. I thought Maxime Bernier did this really, really well by just putting up big billboards. And I think if I was the Dominion Society, I would just put up billboards and posters. I wouldn't have people stand outside to get attention. I don't think that element of the strategy is particularly productive, nor do I think escalating it to kind of the protest type of event is a very valuable way to escalate. So that's kind of what I think about that. The next question here revolves around the CRA nominally targeting Jewish charities. The CRA is desperate to go after donations to religious institutions of all kinds. And unlike many governments across the Western world, they have no particular sympathy for Jewish religious charities. And so just like if you're a Christian charity, they are pretty aggressive about making sure you meet the formal qualifications and have all your I's dotted and your T's crossed. I'm sure they're doing the same thing. The CRA is a very effective organization at raising revenues for the Canadian federal government, and they're pretty relentless in pursuit of that particular objective. So the next question here is about the budget and its impact on direct political patronage. I covered earlier in the lecture that there's some effort here to reform the federal bureaucracy and to reduce the size and scope of that patronage network, but I would characterize that effort as pretty modest. The Canadian government is also not going after things like its support for the NGO network or the network of international organizations that receive funding. It's not going after its support for Ukraine. So it's a pretty it's a pretty modest effort at reducing the patronage commitments of the federal government of Canada. Not the kind of, nothing like the scale that you saw under Chrétien Martin Harper in the 90s. Just not of the same order of magnitude. Advice for the Dominion Society. Yeah, I'll say the same thing publicly that I say privately. The Dominion Society will be the most effective that it can be if it's narrowly focused on the issue of migration and makes the case robustly and in ways that are appealing along axes that will get at multiple groups of people. It should make the case that it's bad for the Canadian government from a neoliberal managerial point of view to import these people, that they're expensive for the state. The data on this is widely available now. Denmark has done a pretty comprehensive series of studies on the financial impact of first and second generation migrants that shows that almost all migrants are net cost to the state. And this is especially true for migrants that come from non-European backgrounds. So which is really what you see in practice, right? This is a huge labor pool that is heavily subsidized by government programs in order to provide at low cost labor to places like Tim Hortons and Starbucks and various restaurants and Walmart and all of these kinds of service providers that provide a lifestyle to the middle and upper middle class. But if you're looking at it from the point of view of a neoliberal manager like Mark Carney, the fact that they're a burden to the state makes them a target for reining in during times when the belt needs to be tightened. So they should make that case. They should make the cultural case to appeal to a broad popular segment. They should make the case that these migrants form political power blocks that make them a threat to the existing political class and their power. They should make the case that they're a threat to Canada's geopolitical position because they inflame tensions with the United States because of their relationship to international networks. They should make every single one of these cases, and they should always make them about migration. They should never, never, never talk about any other issue publicly, even though I'm sure they all have all kinds of other things that they're committed to. They describe themselves, Daniel Tyree describes himself as a nationalist. There's a lot of other things that go with being a nationalist besides believing in low migration. But the Dominion Society will have the most success that it possibly can if it is a single issue pressure group. And if it does not allow itself to be tarred as associated with the far right or associated with, any kind of threat to the existing political order, but instead presents itself as an advocacy group offering solutions. So I don't know whether it will work, but I think that's the best strategy that they can pursue. Okay, so there's a comment here that I think I mentioned in the past that more people should make content. What I mean by this, I actually had this experience this week. So you guys all saw that I did a couple of essays for Remembrance Day, reviewing the history of Canada during the Great War. This is I'm glad I did it. There's a whole variety of reasons I did that. But I was also trying to make some video content. I wanted to make something like a Heritage Minute describing the Battle of Kitchener's Wood in detail. But the technicals involved in the making of short videos at a high enough level to get them wide circulation they're not my strong suit. So I worked on it a bit. I may eventually produce it, but what we need in Canada is not like more and more political analysts. There are some, we probably need a few more, but what we need is cultural content, content that celebrates our people, that celebrates their past, their future, that celebrates their culture, their religious tradition, that puts forward a positive vision of what we can be as a people and what we have been as a people. And so, different people are going to have different strengths and weaknesses in making that kind of content. Some people are going to be more analytical. Some people are going to be more creative. But you should play to your strengths within that space, and you should make your contribution on the platform that best suits those strengths. And you can do that, in association with the stuff that I've been doing, or you can go out there and you can make content that calls me an idiot. I don't care, but at present, the institutions that were kind of set aside by the government to make culture celebrating Canada have been leveraged by the regime to try to erase Canadian identity. And the only appropriate response to that is to try to affirm the identity of your people and cast it forward into the future independently, if and until such time as we have institutions to do it more formally once again. So that's kind of what I meant there. Next question is Canadian integration into the EU. As I said in my review of Carney's budget, none of the investments that would be required in order to make that a valuable exercise are being made. And if they were made, they would take a very, very long time and a historically large financial commitment to make a reality. Whether it would be a good idea or not depends on whether you think the American government would be prepared to respond, and how vital and how much of a future there is in an independent EU elite. I don't think those questions are all that important, because I don't think there's a chance that this is going to happen at any time in the near future. Question here, is it more likely we get based Laurentians or based conservatives? You're going to get neither, right? The Laurentian elite, we'll bring back my favorite boomer here for a second. The Laurentian elite are thoroughly committed to locking the next generation out of power in order to secure their position. They essentially have a coalition between the formal elite and older white Canadians who hold assets that have locked the door on collective power for the foreseeable future. And that's not going to change in the immediate term. There's going to have to be a pretty serious disruptive event before that happens. And if you see a quote-unquote based Laurentian elite, it's going to be a Laurentian elite on the other side of some kind of terrible trauma. Equally, the Western elite that support the Conservative Party of Canada are very committed to neoliberal internationalism and will not be shaken from this commitment short of a very disruptive and traumatic event. So if you're going to have a very disruptive and traumatic event, it's very hard to predict who it will happen to and what the consequences will be. And it's quite likely that at some or all of the existing elite in Canada will be circulated out and circulated in, depending on your perspective, before there's a fundamental change in governing philosophy. So I don't look for like a road to Damascus kind of moment where the existing Canadian elite turn around, see the errors of their ways, and become committed again to solus populi suprema lex with regard to the actual Canadian people. What happens to bond yields after the budget passes? I've said this before. There's some runway that the Canadian government has before they run into a bond or currency crisis. So I think the answer is very little. I think but the problem I see with the budget is not the large deficit. The problem is the lack of new direction. right? This is Carney continuing to believe that he can just kind of wait out the Trump administration and all the problems will go away and they'll be able to go back to business as usual. None of that's going to happen. And so the strategy of the holding pattern strategy here is a very bad idea. It's just going to make everything worse. Is Ontario balkanizing? Is there signs of elite infighting? I mean, this is going to be a very interesting story to follow in the next, both in Ontario and BC over the next 5 years, as the rate of migration into the country slows down and the massive patronage network for real estate development starts to have the wheels come off. You've already seen this in Ontario with retracements in real estate prices that have substantially reduced the rewards for new development and the extent to which being a contractor is lucrative. And suddenly you've discovered that all kinds of blue collar white people who you would think of as conservative coded are very committed to Ford and his neoliberal project, and they're very upset that it's kind of that they don't necessarily understand exactly why things are getting bad for them, but they're not very happy about it. I don't think the political consequences of that are all kind of played out yet. I think there's a long way to go before we find out what's going to happen there. Should conservatives in Canada follow the Reform UK model? Probably not. Canada's politics are regional and not ideological. There's no opportunity to break the hold of the CPC on Alberta. If you try to flank the Conservative Party from the right with a Reform Party, you're going to fail. You're going to get if you do it perfectly, you're going to get 30 seats in rural Ontario and, a few other places. But you're not going to displace the CPC as the party of power in Western Canada. This is the lesson of Maxime Bernier, where you kind of top out at 9% of the vote when the abuse of the Conservative base is at its absolute zenith during COVID. So I think it would be not very intelligent to attempt to make that move in Canada. Similar question here, looking at popular representation versus first past the post. Again, I think popular representation is probably good if you want to weaken the federal government and strengthen the regional governments, which is something that I tactically support at this juncture. So I think if you could make the move, it would be good, even though it's bad for Canada as a political entity to fracture power further, because by fracturing power further, it'll make it harder to exert authority through the country, and it will move us closer to de facto control at a more local level, which means more opportunities to preserve the Canadian nation. So that's my view on PR versus first past the post. I'm very skeptical of democracy as a governing system. I don't think it's. I don't think that you should. I don't think that in principle it's a system that has any real value. I think it's kind of a disgusting aberration of the late 20th century, and I just think that your operation within that framework is simply tactical to get to some kind of better future. Okay, there's a technical question here about campaign contributors that maybe I'll address in an article. Let's see if there's any other question, if there's questions in the YouTube chat before I close it up that are of any value. How should Canadians organize politically? Okay, so the Dominion Society is an excellent template in that it is a pressure group organized around an issue that will focus on that issue rather than and try to get something accomplished in federal politics. That's one way to organize to try to moderate the problems that exist in Canada. So that's one level on which Canadians should approach politics. The other level on which I think Canadians would be well advised to approach politics is the formation of elite associated with their sectional grouping within the country. So I think that the strategy broadly here is parallelism, the formation of social institutions that duplicate functions that the state performs badly. Education is the most obvious of these functions, where you've seen essentially total collapse of the government education system into a combination of a visa grift and a kind of ideological indoctrination factory, right? The results for Canadian public schools, those students are horrendous in most jurisdictions, and the results of grads from the Canadian university system are pretty bad as well. So there's a tremendous opportunity for organizations like Christian denominations or groups of churches to get together and create parallel institutions that deal with the education problem, and in so doing, create a leadership class that is bonded by interest and bonded spiritually to the group of people that they lead in Canada, in that sort of sectional part of Canada. And I don't think that Canadian politics can get back on course until there are all kinds of leaders that emerge from these intermediate institutions with real groups of people politically behind them. I think those are the kinds of political leaders that we need for what's coming next in this country. And I think from those groups will eventually emerge the people capable of representing us well on a national level, assuming that Canada survives at the scale that it currently exists. So those are that's my thought as to the primary methods here are parallelism, both in terms of dealing with the real problems of real people, also in terms of developing an elite capable of leading the sectional subgroups here. I don't think that it's a good idea to try to have a single elite class spanning every group in this country. This country, from its very inception, is a political vehicle designed to protect various people groups from the encroaching interests of the United States. It was two, maybe three people groups at the beginning. It's more now. And I think that arrangement is only going to work if you have robust leaders and for each of those people groups underneath, capable of politically negotiating to produce a government that we can all kind of live with, peace, order, and good governance once again. So that's that piece, combined with where there are specific issues where we really need relief. And I think mass migration is one of those specific issues where if we don't get some relief from it, it's going to really create very permanent damage to the prospects of passing this nation to our descendants. Where you need immediate relief, the right way to go about it is to have these single issue pressure groups that are organized not as political parties, but organized to try to pressure across the entire political spectrum to deal with particular problems that your people just can't live with. I think that there should be an equivalent to the Dominion Society that advocates for justice for the victims of, that advocates for justice for the 100 and some odd churches that have been burned or vandalized in the wake of the residential school revelations, let's call it that, in 2022. This is like the JCCF does some of this work, but we need to get a lot deeper and a lot more broad-based than just doing legal activism to try to protect our people in that way. So I think that's another really, really important route that needs to be pursued, along with the creation of content which affirms our culture, right? One of the things that divides me from many people in the online right is that I'm not I don't believe in wide cultural engagement. I believe that a person should be able to live most of their life in the art and imagination of their own culture, and that there's tremendous value in experiencing one culture in tremendous depth. In other words, I'm anti-cosmopolitan, even though I have a lot of cosmopolitan experience myself in my life. I believe that there's a shallowness that accompanies that, a shallowness and an inherent skepticism and a kind of cynicism that comes from that way of enculturating yourself. And I think that subsequent generations of Canadians should have the opportunity to be deeply steeped in the religious and artistic traditions that have defined our various peoples. And they should be able to, I think this is a really important project going forward, that there should be enough of our culture to be able to do that. And right now, I don't think there is. How did the interests of real estate development come to dominate politics in Ontario? That is a whole other podcast, I'm afraid. But that's been going on for maybe 30 or 40 years at least. It might have been going on a lot longer than that. I don't know. But it's prima facie, it superseded industrial interests in the 90s. In the 90s, as a result of NAFTA, there was a mega recession in Canadian manufacturing that really severely affected Ontario, and especially southwestern Ontario. Every industry except maybe the agricultural industry was deeply impacted by it. And the consequence was that in many ways, real estate was the last industry standing. And it got supercharged because of the way that the subsequent decade and a half of finance and immigration policy was managed. So certainly it came to its zenith of power under Ford as a consequence of those two trends, but it probably has a longer history than that is beyond my kind of immediate knowledge. All right, I'm just going to check the Twitter post and see if there are any other questions that are worth addressing here. But I think that will do it for today's show. Thank you so much to everyone who listened, participated, asked a question. I always like having a pretty broad base of questions to deal with. I think they make the show more interesting for everyone. So glad to those who responded. See, we've got like 500 viewers on Twitter. So I'm doing a lot better out of that platform than I am doing over here on YouTube. So that's interesting. Thank you to everybody on whatever platform you engaged on. Enjoy your evening.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.